Hello. In the previous lectures, we looked at the Great Learning and Zhu Xi's interpretation of it, and then the Journal of Wu Yubi. In this lecture, we're going to look at a different approach to self-cultivation as described by the philosopher Wang Yangming. Wang Yangming, just like Zhu Xi, had an early exposure to Buddhism and Taoism. And like Zhu, Wang eventually came to embrace Confucianism in response. And at first, he tried to embrace the type of Confucianism that Zhu Xi had advocated for, a type of Confucianism that emphasized the need for intellectual investigation of pattern. There's an interesting anecdote about this. Recall that pattern or principle is supposed to be exemplified in everything that exists. And so Wang decided to take this up. And so he tried to do this by looking at bamboo in his father's house. So he looked at this bamboo plant for 7 days and nights, trying to look closer and closer in order to see if he could actually see the pattern, discern it in some way. And of course, that didn't really work. He just stared at it for too long and was just doing that, and so he becomes sick. After his teenage years, he engages in civil service, but he also attempts to embrace this path of self-cultivation as presented by Zhu Xi and other Neo-Confucian philosophers. But he had great difficulties, and he didn't really think it was working. And so there's a quote here that exemplifies this, where he says, "The heart, mind, and pattern are still two distinct things." Now, the idea for self-cultivation is to make yourself, your heart, mind, one with pattern, one with the way things ought to be. And so he recognized that he wasn't really making any progress. But in his late 30s, he has an insight that will change his perspective on the path to self-cultivation. He recounts this insight as follows. He says that he finally came to understand what all this meant and realized that there's really nothing in the things in the world to investigate. That the effort to investigate things is only to be carried out in and with reference to one's body and mind. And that if one firmly believes that everyone can become a sage, one will naturally be able to take up the task of investigating things. End quote. So notice what he's saying here. Unlike looking at the bamboo plant, we ought to go inside. Don't go outside and investigate things in the world, but where we should begin is not through intellectual investigation, but rather improving one's mental state and looking for knowledge within oneself. This is explicitly expressed in a poem that he had written. Quote, "Everyone has within an unerring compass. The root and source of the myriad transformations lies in the mind. I laugh when I think that earlier I saw things the other way around. Falling branches and leaves, I searched outside." So what I've just done is present his insight that led to this conversion or transformation. What I want to do now is explain what reasons he had for having this different new view, and that will help us see what this new view actually amounts to and how it differs from Zhu Xi. In one passage, Wang says, quote, "If the ultimate good only meant getting the details of behavior correct, then an actor could be said to have attained the ultimate good. An actor that, masters the exact behaviors, the external manifestations of what you ought to do. But the actor is not really being good. They're just acting the part." So what we learned there is that external behavior alone is not sufficient to count as self-cultivated. There's another passage in which he makes a similar point. Quote, "One cannot say he knows filial piety or brotherly respect simply because he knows how to say something filial or brotherly." So just like it's not enough to have the external behavior be correct, it's also not enough just to simply be able to say what is good, to have linguistic knowledge of what is right and wrong. So what's the alternative? Well, he says it like this, quote, knowing pain offers another good example. One must have experienced pain oneself in order to know pain, end quote. Notice what he's emphasizing here with that example. You need experience, but this experience is also something internal to yourself. So it's not out there in the world. Pain is something that goes on in your own mind. And so that's what Wang will advocate, as opposed to having the details of external behavior correct, as with the actor, or having one's words be correct. Rather, one's mind needs to be correct. Now let us turn to how Wang uses this sort of point to develop a different interpretation of the first step of the Great Learning, an interpretation different from Juxi's. So recall that for Juxi, the first step of the Great Learning is to investigate principle or pattern in things in the world. So that first step, Chinese there is a very kind of ambiguous phrase, and so it can be translated as get a handle on things. But it can be interpreted in a variety of ways. Juxi goes with investigate for what it means to get a handle, and the things that you are investigating are the pattern of things, what ultimately exists, the ultimately existing things. Now, Wang thinks that's overly intellectual and misleading for what we need to prioritize for self-cultivation. So he interprets it as follows. He says that getting a handle is to be interpreted more like correcting whatever is not correct and returning to what is correct. And this means to do various things. You get rid of the things that are bad inside of you and to do good things. And that's bolstered by how he interprets the latter half of this phrase, the getting a handle on things. What are the things that we get a handle on? Well, simply for Wang, tasks or affairs. I think the word task there is really important. So rather than getting a handle on the structure of a thing, this metaphysical idea or principle, rather we're getting a handle on how to do something or a task that needs to be carried out or done. So what the consequence of all this is that Wang emphasizes action more than knowledge compared to Juxi. And the action is going to amount to making your thoughts sincere, correcting your mind. And so that's what the learning process will amount to, the self-cultivation process will amount to. We can see this by how he interprets the phrase extending knowledge, that second step of the Great Learning. So he recognizes the Great Learning is an important text and that we ought to extend knowledge as it says, but he disputes the earlier interpretation of that. So in the earlier interpretation of that, we extend the knowledge that we acquire by reading text, by reading the histories, by reading what other sages had to say. That is to say, we go outside of ourselves to learn from others. Now, what Wang says instead is that we need to go inside of ourselves. We need to use what he calls pure knowing which is already within us. And in fact, there's a precedent for this. So that whole concept of extending knowledge or extension comes from the philosopher Mengzi. And so what Wang does is say that Mengzi had already the correct interpretation. And this is so because we have those innate moral sprouts. And those innate moral sprouts are not just simply behaviors or actions, but also knowledge of right and wrong. So to summarize, the point there is that Juxi thought we should go outside of ourselves through intellectual investigation. Wang thinks that we need to look inside of ourselves. So you might now ask, how is that supposed to work? Well, how it's supposed to work, I think, is exemplified by the following passage. So recall that Mengzi describes this famous case of seeing a child about to fall in a well, and you have this immediate feeling of concern or compassion for the child. And so that indicates that you have this moral sprout. But Wang kind of gives it an interesting twist. So this is what he says. When you see a child about to fall in a well, then you cannot avoid having this feeling of alarm and compassion because of a specific reason. What he says is, it's because, quote, their benevolence forms one body with the child. Now that's an interesting phrase, and so Wang spends a little bit of time to explain what he means by forming one body. And I've just summarized it on the slide here. So he entertains various options for what this could mean and rejects those various options. So one option would be that you recognize that you share certain features with the child, that you're the same species, you're both of the human species, and Wang says that's not really explaining why you feel this way, why you have this immediate feeling of concern or compassion. Rather, Wang's point is not simply because you are part of the same species as the child, but rather that you're one with everything else, that you share something in common with everything else that exists. Now notice that this kind of adopts a Neo-Confucian point from earlier. So Jushi emphasizes that pattern is shared by everything. And this is something that's already in Mengzi. And so Wang accepts that same thing that Jushi had accepted and emphasized pattern. But Wang does something different with it. What Wang does is emphasize that we can recognize this shared pattern or principle in our experience, and that we need to recognize it in order to overcome our selfish desires, in order to get rid of those selfish desires. And the result of that process of getting rid of our selfish desires is that we come to form one body with everything else, that we become one with everything else and not really a distinct self. So I think the point there is still a little bit abstract, but I think we can illustrate his point by using a more recent concept. This is the concept of a Gestalt switch. Gestalt simply means in German something like form or figure or shape. And so a Gestalt switch occurs when we change the way that we're looking at something. So most of you are familiar, at the very least, with the Rubin figure, this picture that looks like either two faces or a vase, depending on what you emphasize as foreground or background. And there are a lot of images like this. What I think Wang is advocating for us to do by looking inside of ourselves is advocating for us to take a different perspective, and that perspective comes from within inside of oneself. And we're supposed to use that different perspective inside of ourselves to look at things in the world differently, to look at the child about to fall in the well as not any different from oneself, to look at pebbles on the ground as no different from oneself. So you change your perspective on matters and de-emphasize the selfish aspects of your experience and emphasize the commonalities, the shared principle between different things. So that's what I think is the procedure that we're primarily supposed to use in the process of self-cultivation, this change in perspective. What I've done in this lecture is explain Wang Yangming's general orientation regarding the process of self-cultivation, and I emphasized the importance of perspective in that process. In the next lecture, I'm going to explain a few further details of Wang's thought and compare Wang to Jushi.